Stephen Wright was born on April 24th, 1958 in Norfolk, England. His early life was marked by instability and emotional dysfunction. Accounts from people who knew him described a childhood lacking in warmth and structure. And as he grew older, he developed a pattern of failed relationships, compulsive behaviours, and emotional volatility. Wright struggled to maintain stability throughout adulthood, and over the years he worked numerous jobs, including as a merchant seaman, a truck driver, a steward aboard the luxury cruise liner, the QE2, a bartender, and a long-haul driver. He travelled extensively but never seemed to be able to settle into a stable identity or career. Former partners of Stevens later described him as manipulative, controlling, jealous, and sexually obsessive. Several women who knew him spoke about disturbing behaviour, including aggression and coercive tendencies, and this was years before the murders even come to light. By the early 2000s, Wright was living in Ipswich, Suffolk, an area that had developed a significant street prostitution scene, tied heavily on heroin addiction. Many of the women working the streets were trapped in cycles of poverty, substance dependency, and trauma. Wright became a familiar figure in these areas, and investigators later concluded that he specifically targeted vulnerable women because they were less likely to be immediately missed and more likely to enter a stranger's vehicle without raising suspicion. The victims were not random in the sense that Wright appeared drawn towards a very particular profile. Women battle addiction, living chaotic lives, and surviving through sex work, basically. But while society often overlooked these women, the investigation that followed would force Britain to confront how easily vulnerable people can disappear without urgent attention. The first known victim in the Suffolk murder series was 19-year-old Tanya Nicol, who vanished on October the 30th, 2006. Tanya had struggled with drug addiction and had been working in Ipswich's red light district. Friends and family became concerned quickly, but initially there was no public sign that a serial killer might even be operating in the area. Weeks later, on December the 8th, her body was discovered in a stream near Coptop Mill. She had been strangled. The discovery shocked investigators, but the horror escalated rapidly when another body was found literally only days later. The second victim was that of 25-year-old Gemma Adams, who had disappeared on November the 15th, 2006. Like Tanya, she was battling heroin addiction and working as a sex worker in Ipswich. On December the 2nd, her body was found clothless in a ditch near Hindlesham. Detectives immediately recognised similarities between the cases. Both women had vanished from the same area. Both of them had histories tied to prostitution and addiction. Both of them had also been strangled. Public fear began spreading through Suffolk as police quietly considered the possibility that this was actually a serial offender targeting women in Ipswich. Then the situation just exploded into national panic. In less than 2 weeks, 3 more bodies were discovered. Annette Nichols, aged 29, disappeared on December the 5th. Paula Clennell, 24, vanished shortly afterwards. And finally, 24-year-old Anne Alderton disappeared on December the 3rd. Within days, all 3 women were found dead in rural locations surrounding Ipswich. The speed at which the bodies were discovered created unprecedented fear across the county. Media outlets descended on Suffolk, broadcasting live from outside police cordons and comparing the murders to those of Jack the Ripper. Residents were terrified, as you can imagine. Women stopped walking alone at night. Sex workers were warned to stay indoors, though many could not even afford to stop working, which was a worry. The atmosphere in Ipswich became one of paranoia and dread. What disturbed investigators even more was the condition of some of the bodies. Certain victims appeared posed, if you like, after the death, suggesting an element of ritual or psychological gratification beyond murder itself. This behaviour pointed towards an organised offender who enjoyed exerting power and control over the victims. Profilers believed the killer was confident, familiar with the local geography, mobile, and likely even returning to normal life immediately after the murders. They also suspected he had probably offended before. Police launched one of the largest murder investigations in British history at this point. At its peak, more than 1,500 officers were assigned to the case. Roads were monitored, thousands of vehicles were checked, CCTV footage was reviewed around the clock, and forensic teams combed through masses of amounts of evidence. The investigation became a race against time because detectives actually feared that the killer was going to strike again. Undercover operations were deployed to Ipswich red light district, while officers attempted to identify every man known to frequent this area. The case generated an enormous pressure from both the public and the media, with many fearing a sixth victim was imminent. Amid the panic, Steve Wright quietly inserted himself into the public narrative. In one particular chilling moment, he gave interviews to reporters expressing concern about the murders and discussing fear within the community. Let me just pause this case 1 minute. What on earth is actually wrong? I mean, they're not right, are they, to be doing what they're doing? But to stick yourself out there when you're actually the perpetrator, it takes me back to Ian Huntley doing it in the Jessica Chapman and Holly Wells case. What on earth is actually wrong with them? They definitely cannot be wired like normal people like us. Like many notorious serial killers before him, he appeared fascinated by the investigation that was unfolding around him. Some criminologists later suggested he enjoyed watching the terror spread, while believing he actually remained invisible to the police. Forensic evidence was steadily closing in, and detectives linked Wright to several victims through DNA recovered from their bodies. Fibres found on the victims matched materials from his Ford Mondeo and his home. CCTV footage captured his vehicle in areas connected to the murders. The jury heard extensive forensic testimony linking him to every victim. Families of the victims sat through the harrowing evidence detailing the final movements of their daughters, sisters and mothers. One particularly emotional aspect of the trial that involved Paula Connell, because shortly before the murder, Paula had appeared in a television documentary discussing her hopes of overcoming addiction and rebuilding her life for her children. After her death, clips from the documentary circulated widely across Britain, turning her into a heartbreaking symbol of the tragedy. The case actually challenged widespread stereotypes about sex workers and addiction by forcing the public to actually see the victims as human beings with families, with histories, and with dreams, rather than statistics or headlines. In February 2008, the jury found Steve Wright guilty of murdering all 5 women. The jury sentenced him to a whole life order, one of the harshest punishments available in the UK justice system, meaning he will never be released from prison. During the sentencing, the judge described the murders as cruel, calculated and sexually motivated. Wright showed little visible emotion as the verdicts were read. Even after the conviction, many investigators and criminologists believed the story was not over. Serial killers rarely begin murdering at the age of 48, and with such intensity and confidence as well. Wright appeared highly practiced in avoiding detection during the early stages of the murder, leading to experts suspecting he may have killed before 2006. Rumours and theories circulated for years linking him to unsolved cases across England. Detectives quietly reviewed old files involving murders or missing women whose cases shared similarities with Wright's known crimes and victims. Those suspicions gained major credibility decades later when Wright admitted responsibility for the 1999 murder of 17-year-old Victoria Hall. Hall had vanished after a night out with friends in Felixstowe, Suffolk. Her body was discovered days later in water-filled ditch miles away. The murder had remained unsolved for over 20 years and become one of Suffolk's most haunting cold cases. In 2006, so this is only this year, Wright confessed to abducting and killing Hall, finally providing answers to her family after decades of uncertainty. Authorities also revealed that Wright admitted attempting to abduct another young woman around the same period. The revelations dramatically changed public understanding of his criminal timeline and strengthened fears that additional unidentified victims may actually still exist. Criminal psychologists who study Wright often point to his need for dominance and sexual control. Unlike killers motivated purely by rage or financial gain, he appeared driven by a desire to overpower vulnerable women and dictate life or death outcomes. His victims, dependent on drugs and survival, sex work made them easier to isolate and manipulate, I suppose. Investigators believed he carefully selected women who society frequently ignored, a pattern actually seen in multiple serial murder cases worldwide. The Suffolk Strangler case was exposed larger societal failures. Families of victims repeatedly stated that their loved ones were often dismissed because of addiction or prostitution. Advocacy groups argued that the murders highlighted how vulnerable women can become invisible until tragedy forces public attention onto them. The case sparked debate in Britain over policing strategies, addiction treatments, support services for sex workers, and even how missing person cases involving marginalised individuals are handled. Today, Stephen Wright remains incarcerated under a whole life sentence, spending his remaining days inside maximum security prison conditions. Yet, despite his conviction, questions still linger. Investigators have never fully ruled out the possibility of additional victims. Some experts actually believe the known murders may represent only a fraction of his violent history. Others point to the long gap between Victoria Hall's murder in 2009 and the Ipswich killings in 2006 as evidence that there may be crimes still undiscovered, and whether the full extent of his violence will ever be known, and that remains uncertain. The Suffolk Strangler murders remain one of Britain's most disturbing true crime cases, not simply because of the number of victims, but because of what the crimes revealed about the predation, vulnerability and invisibility in modern society. Steve Wright exploited women living at the edge of survival, counting on the idea that their disappearance might not generate immediate urgency. Instead, the murders triggered one of the biggest manhunts in British criminal history and left scars that continue to haunt Suffolk decades later. This never no matter how many times I do this case and how many times I watch things on it or programmes or when it was actually happening at the time, it's shocking. And I remember at the time seeing newspaper articles and it was saying about the sex workers, and no, that's somebody's mum, that's somebody's daughter, that's somebody's sister, auntie, a friend, do you know? Have you heard of this case? Do you know about this case? Or do you think that he has actually? There is victims that are not counted for and unknown, because the gap between Victoria Hall's murder and the Ipswich killings does point to, it's unlikely there's not going to be anyone in between that. Let me know what you think in the comments.